Hey guys, tonight we begin with the brutal truth about medieval survival. Your soft, modern body, accustomed to comfort and cleanliness, would crumble before your first medieval meal was digested. What seemingly harmless daily activity had a death rate of nearly 10% in medieval times? The answer reveals how utterly unprepared we are for the world our ancestors navigated daily. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together, the morning awakening. Congratulations, you've just woken up in the year 1347. The good news, you're alive. The bad news, that might not last long. Your bed isn't the memory foam mattress you're used to. Instead, you're lying on a lumpy sack stuffed with straw that hasn't been changed in months. The bed isn't just uncomfortable, it's alive with fleas, bedbugs, and possibly mice that have made homes in the stuffing. That itch you feel? It's not your imagination. You're being bitten, right now, by creatures too small to see in the dim morning light. Speaking of light, there isn't much. Your one-room peasant dwelling has no windows. Windows with glass are for the wealthy. At most, you might have a small opening covered with oiled parchment or a wooden shutter, currently closed against the night's chill. The only illumination comes from the dying embers of last night's fire, casting ghostly shadows across the packed earth floor. The air is thick with smoke. Unlike modern homes with proper chimneys, your medieval dwelling has, at best, a small hole in the thatched roof. Most of the smoke from your cooking fire simply lingers inside, gradually finding its way out through the thatch. This constant smoke exposure has already begun damaging your lungs, and your eyes sting constantly. Medieval peasants often developed chronic breathing problems and eye conditions. That scratchy feeling in your throat isn't just from sleep, it's from breathing smoke all night. You're not alone in this small, dark space. Medieval privacy didn't exist. Your entire family, parents, children, possibly grandparents or other relatives, all sleep in this single room. In poorer households, you might even share the space with your livestock. That smell isn't just smoke and unwashed bodies, it's also animal dung. The animals at least provide some warmth during winter nights, a fair trade-off in a world without central heating. As your eyes adjust to the gloom, you become aware of the sounds. Someone is coughing, a deep, wet cough that never quite goes away. Tuberculosis? Pneumonia. In medieval times, these weren't just illnesses, they were death sentences. There's no antibiotics here, no hospitals with trained doctors. That persistent cough might be the last sound someone makes before they're buried in the village cemetery. You stretch and immediately regret it. Your body aches in ways you've never experienced before. You're only 30, but in medieval terms, you're middle-aged. Years of hard physical labor in the fields have worn down your joints. Your back throbs from yesterday's work, and your hands are calloused and cracked. What modern people might do as an occasional weekend workout, medieval peasants did from dawn until dusk, every single day. The cold seeps through your thin woolen garments. It's spring, but the morning chill still bites. There's no thermostat to adjust, no warm shower to look forward to. You slept in the same clothes you wore yesterday, and will wear today, tomorrow, and possibly for weeks to come. Changing clothes was not a daily occurrence in medieval Europe. In fact, you might own only 2 sets of clothing, one for everyday wear, and one slightly better outfit for church and special occasions. Your stomach growls, reminding you of hunger, not the kind of hunger you feel after skipping a meal in the modern world. This is a deeper, more familiar sensation. In medieval Europe, especially during certain seasons, Hunger was your constant companion. Your last meal was a thin gruel made from barley, perhaps with some dried vegetables thrown in. It wasn't enough, but it rarely is. As you sit up on your straw mattress, something else becomes apparent. The smell, not just the animals or the smoke, but your own body. Personal hygiene in medieval Europe bears little resemblance to modern standards. You haven't bathed in months, possibly not since last summer. Water had to be hauled from wells or streams, then heated over fires in small amounts. Full-body bathing was rare, reserved for special occasions. The wealthy might bathe monthly. Peasants were lucky to bathe a few times a year. Instead of bathing, you might wipe your face and hands with a damp cloth. Your teeth have never been brushed. Toothbrushes, as we know them, didn't exist. At best, you might rub your teeth with a frayed twig, or rinse your mouth with water. The state of dental health is as you might expect. Painful, rotting teeth are common, even among young people. That dull ache in your jaw, it's been there for months, getting steadily worse. Reluctantly, you swing your feet onto the floor. The ground is cold, hard-packed earth, possibly strewn with rushes or straw that haven't been changed in weeks. These floor coverings conceal a multitude of debris, food scraps, dirt tracked in from outside, insect larvae, mouse droppings, and worse. With each step, small creatures scatter from beneath your feet. It's time to begin your day, though you haven't checked the time. You can't. There are no clocks in your home, no watches on your wrist. Medieval time was marked by church bells, the position of the sun, and the changing season. Your body, attuned to the natural rhythms of daylight, wakes you at dawn and sends you to sleep, not long after sunset. And so begins your morning in medieval Europe. You haven't even started your day's work, and already your body is dealing with conditions that would send a modern person running to doctors, exterminators, and possibly therapists. The discomfort you're experiencing isn't temporary. It's life, day after day, year after year, with little hope of improvement. Are you still confident about surviving that single day in medieval times? The morning ablutions. Now comes one of the first major challenges of your medieval day, answering nature's call. In the modern world, this mundane activity takes place in private, sanitary bathrooms with flushing toilets and running water. In medieval Europe, the experience is rather different. If you're lucky enough to live in a larger town, there might be public latrines, basically wooden platforms built over running streams or rivers. These communal toilets offer little privacy and plenty of opportunity for disease transmission. In some larger castles or monasteries, there might be specially designed rooms built into the walls called gardobees, essentially holes that drop waste directly outside the walls. But you're a common peasant in a rural village. For you, the options are simpler. A chamber pot kept under the bed, which someone will need to empty later, or a quick trip outside to the midden heap. Essentially, an open-air waste pile, not far from your dwelling. There's no toilet paper, of course. You might use moss, leaves, or straw. The wealthy sometimes used wool or hemp, but for peasants, nature provided the wiping materials. You choose the trip outside, if only to escape the smoky interior of your home for a moment. The morning air is crisp, but the smell that greets you is not. Medieval villages had no sewage systems or garbage collection. Waste of all kinds, human, animal, and household, was simply tossed onto communal middens or into the nearest body of water. The concept of germ theory won't exist for hundreds of years. No one has connected this disposal method with the frequent outbreaks of disease that sweep through communities. This casual approach to waste has consequences beyond the obvious smell. The ground around your village is contaminated. The water sources are contaminated. Even the food. grown in fields, fertilized with human waste, carries bacteria that would horrify modern health inspectors. Your medieval immune system, exposed to these pathogens from birth, has developed some resistance. Your modern immune system, it's in for a shock. Having relieved yourself, you might think about washing your hands. But where? And with what? There's no sink, no soap, as you know it. At best, you might rinse your hands in a bucket of water drawn from the well, the same well that everyone else uses, possibly contaminated by that nearby midden heap. Soap, when available, is a harsh substance made from animal fat and lye, used primarily for laundry rather than personal cleanliness. Back inside, it's time to think about breaking your fast. The concept of breakfast as a proper meal is actually somewhat foreign to medieval Europe. Many people, especially laborers, might eat only 2 meals a day, one at mid-morning and one in the early evening. But you're hungry, and there might be some leftovers from last night's meal. Your medieval morning meal bears little resemblance to modern breakfast. Forget coffee. It's virtually unknown in medieval Europe. Forget toast with butter and jam. White bread is for the wealthy, and sugar is an expensive luxury imported from distant lands. Instead, your breakfast might consist of a piece of coarse, dark bread made from rye or barley, perhaps with some ale to wash it down. Yes, ale, in a world where water sources are often contaminated. Fermented beverages are sometimes the safer option, even in the morning. If your family is doing well, you might add a bit of cheese to your bread, or in certain seasons, some fresh fruit from nearby trees. Eggs would be a luxury for most peasants, saved for trading or special occasions. This diet, while simple, is also lacking in many nutrients that modern people take for granted. Vitamin deficiencies were common, leading to conditions like scurvy, rickets, and night blindness. As you chew your dense, gritty bread, you notice something else: your teeth hurt. Medieval dental care wasn't just primitive, it was practically non-existent. There were no regular cleanings, no fillings for cavities, no braces to straighten crooked teeth. Tooth decay was accepted as an inevitable part of aging. If a tooth caused too much pain, it would be pulled without anesthesia by the local barber or blacksmith. Using crude pliers, many adults were missing multiple teeth, and complete tooth loss was common by middle age. Your morning meal finished, it's time to prepare for the day's work. You don't stand under a hot shower, lather up with scented soap, or brush your teeth with mint toothpaste. You might splash some cold water on your face from a basin, run your fingers through your hair, and perhaps chew on a sprig of mint or fennel, if available, to freshen your breath. Your clothing doesn't need much thought. You'll wear the same outfit you slept in, perhaps adding a heavier outer layer if the weather demands it. Undergarments, as we know them, didn't exist for most people. Your clothes are made of wool or rough linen, hand-sewn, and designed for durability rather than comfort. They chafe against your skin, especially in areas where the fabric has hardened from sweat and dirt. Women might cover their hair with a linen cap or kerchief, not just for modesty, but also for practical reasons, to keep it cleanish and out of the way during work. Men might wear a simple cap or hood, especially in colder weather. The elaborate hairstyles and fashionable hats depicted in medieval artwork were primarily for the nobility, not ordinary working people. Your footwear, if you have any, consists of simple leather shoes or wooden clogs. They offer minimal protection and no arch support. Many peasants, especially in warmer months, might go barefoot to save their shoes for winter or special occasions. Your feet, as a result, are tough and calloused, but also frequently injured and infected. As you prepare to step outside and begin your day's labor, you catch a glimpse of yourself in a bucket of still water, the closest thing to a mirror in your household. The face that looks back at you is weathered beyond its years. Your skin is darkened and leathered from constant sun exposure, lined with premature wrinkles. Your hair is dull and possibly infested with lice, a common problem that even royalty wasn't immune to. Your eyes look tired because you are, always. This is how you begin each day in medieval Europe. No refreshing shower, no minty toothpaste, no clean clothes, no nutritious breakfast, just discomfort, dirt, and hunger, the constant companions of medieval life, and your day has barely begun. Still confident about surviving that single day. The morning labor. The real challenge of medieval life begins when you step out to start your day's work. Forget the 9-to-5 workday with coffee breaks, air conditioning, and ergonomic office chairs. Medieval labor was sunup to sundown, physically grueling and performed regardless of weather conditions or personal health. For most peasants, work meant agricultural labor. Depending on the season, you might be plowing, sowing, weeding, or harvesting. These weren't activities performed with the aid of tractors or modern farm equipment. Plowing meant walking behind an ox or horse, struggling to keep the heavy wooden plow straight in the soil. Planting meant bending repeatedly to sow seeds by hand. Harvesting meant swinging a scythe or sickle for hours on end, then binding and stacking the cut grain. The physical toll was immense. Modern people who engage in historical reenactments of medieval farming often find themselves exhausted after just an hour or two. Medieval peasants did this work from dawn until dusk, day after day, with tools that were heavy, unwieldy, and inefficient by modern standards. The strain on your body would be constant. Back pain would be your daily companion. Your hands would develop thick calluses from handling rough wooden tools, yet still crack and bleed, especially in cold weather. Joint pain would start early in life, with arthritis setting in by your 30s or 40s. The average peasant was physically worn out by what we would now consider middle age. Weather offered no reprieve. In summer, you worked under the blazing sun without sunscreen, proper hydration, or breaks in air-conditioned spaces. Heat stroke was common and often fatal. In winter, you endured freezing temperatures with inadequate clothing, your hands and feet perpetually cold and possibly frostbitten. Rain didn't stop the necessary work of survival. You simply got wet and kept working, increasing your risk of illness. If you weren't engaged in agricultural labor, you might be a tradesperson, a blacksmith, carpenter, tanner, or weaver. These occupations came with their own hazards. Blacksmiths suffered burns and respiratory problems from forge smoke. Tanners worked with caustic chemicals that damaged their skin and lungs. Weavers developed eye strain and skeletal deformities from hunching over looms for hours. Workplace safety regulations didn't exist. Injuries were frequent and often debilitating. For women, domestic labor was equally demanding. Preparing meals meant grinding grain by hand, kneading dough, and tending fires. Laundry was a major undertaking, requiring hauling water, heating it over fires, scrubbing garments with harsh lye soap, and wringing them out by hand. Childcare was constant and combined with other tasks. Infants might be swaddled and placed nearby while mothers continued their work. Children weren't exempt from labor. From around age 5 or 6, children were expected to contribute to household work. By 7 or 8, many were already working in the fields or learning trades through apprenticeships. The concept of childhood as a protected time for play and education simply didn't exist for most medieval families. The pace of work followed the seasons and the sun, not the clock. During crucial planting and harvesting times, you might work 16 or 18 hours, stopping only for brief meals. Winter offered some respite as agricultural work decreased, but brought other challenges: repairing tools and equipment, spinning and weaving cloth, preserving food. all while trying to stay warm in inadequately heated dwellings. Your medieval labor wasn't just physically challenging, it was also fundamentally insecure. As a peasant, you likely didn't own the land you farmed. You worked the Lord's land, giving him a significant portion of your harvest as rent. Bad weather, plant diseases, or pest infestations could devastate crops, leaving you with little food and the same obligations to your lord. Famines were recurring disasters throughout the medieval period. Even skilled artisans faced economic uncertainty. Guilds regulated who could practice trades, limiting competition but also restricting opportunities. Economic downturns affected everyone, and there was no unemployment insurance or social safety net. Illness or injury that prevented work could quickly lead to destitution. Throughout your working day, there would be few comforts. No coffee break with pastries from the break room. Your midday meal might be carried to the fields, perhaps more coarse bread, maybe some cheese or dried meat if you were fortunate, washed down with water or ale carried in a clay bottle or wooden vessel. You'd eat quickly, sitting on the ground, before returning to labor. Bathroom breaks. There were no designated facilities in the fields. You simply stepped away briefly to relieve yourself with minimal privacy. Hygiene considerations were minimal. There was no place to wash your hands before returning to work or eating your lunch. The monotony of medieval labor was occasionally broken by the church bells marking the canonical hours, reminding the faithful to pause for prayer. These brief moments of respite were welcome, but short. Work would quickly resume. The demands of survival allowed little time for rest or reflection. By midday, your modern body would be screaming in protest. Unused to such sustained physical exertion, you would experience muscle fatigue, dehydration, and possibly the early stages of repetitive stress injuries. The medieval person working beside you, conditioned to this labor from childhood, would be faring better, though they too would feel the strain, accepting it as the inevitable condition of life. As the sun reaches its zenith, you've completed only half your workday in medieval Europe. Your back aches, your hands are blistered, you're hungry, thirsty, and dirty. Modern conveniences like pain relievers, ergonomic tools, and moisture-wicking clothing are centuries away. There is only the work, the relentless work, that stands between your family and starvation. Still think you could survive that single day. The midday meal. As the sun reaches its highest point in the sky, the time has come for the main meal of your medieval day. Unlike modern eating patterns, medieval Europeans typically had their largest meal at midday, rather than in the evening. This practice made practical sense. You needed substantial energy to continue working through the afternoon, and cooking was easier in daylight. If you're working in the fields some distance from home, you might simply eat the food you brought with you. But if circumstances allow, you'd return to your dwelling for a more substantial repast. The walk back offers little relief from your morning's labor. No air-conditioned car ride or comfortable public transportation. Just more walking on feet already sore from hours of work. Back at your home, the midday meal being prepared is nothing like a modern lunch. Forget sandwiches, salads, or microwaved leftovers. The centerpiece of your medieval meal would likely be pottage, a thick, stew-like dish cooked in the home's single pot hung over the fire. Pottage was the ubiquitous peasant food, a catch-all dish that varied with seasons and fortunes. The basic pottage began with grain, oats, barley, or rye, boiled in water until soft and porridge-like. To this base would be added whatever vegetables were available: onions, leeks, cabbage, turnips, and perhaps peas or beans when in season. Herbs growing outside the cottage door might provide some flavor: parsley, sage, thyme, or mint. The wealthier or more fortunate might add small amounts of salted meat or fat for flavor. This pottage wasn't made fresh for each meal. The pot would remain over the fire, with new ingredients added as needed, and the mixture continuing to cook for days or even weeks. Each serving taken out, each new addition put in, changed the character of this ever-evolving dish. Today's pottage contained bits of yesterday's, which contained elements from the day before, and so on. A culinary connection to the past that could sometimes turn dangerous as spoilage set in. To accompany your pottage, there would be bread, but not the light, fluffy bread of modern bakeries. Peasant bread was dense, dark, and often made from mixed grains, because pure wheat flour was too expensive for everyday consumption. The grinding process for flour was primitive, done with stone mills that left grit in the final product. This grit would gradually wear down your teeth over years of consumption. Another factor in the poor dental health of medieval people. The bread might be several days old, as baking was labor-intensive and fuel-consuming. Few homes had proper ovens. Bread was often baked in community ovens where villagers would bring their dough to be cooked for a fee. Stale bread would be softened by soaking it in broth or ale, with nothing wasted. Your beverage choices would be limited. Water was often suspect, especially in villages where waste management was poor. Small beer or ale was the common drink for all ages. The fermentation process made it safer than untreated water. This wasn't the high-alcohol beer of modern craft breweries, but rather a lightly fermented, low-alcohol beverage consumed throughout the day. Wine existed but was reserved for the wealthy or special occasions for common folk. Dairy products might supplement your meal, depending on the season and your circumstances. Cheese, particularly soft cheese that didn't require long aging, was a valuable source of protein. Milk itself was less common as a beverage without refrigeration. Fresh milk soured quickly, and was more valuable, transformed into cheese or butter. Fresh fruit would be a seasonal treat, not the year-round abundance we're accustomed to. Apples, pears, cherries and berries would be eagerly consumed when available, then absent from the diet for months. Vegetables followed similar patterns of seasonal availability, with winter months bringing a much more restricted diet dependent on what could be stored: root vegetables, dried legumes, and preserved cabbage. Meat was a luxury for most peasants, not a daily expectation. You might consume meat only a few times a month, or even less frequently. When available, it would likely be preserved, salted, smoked, or dried, rather than fresh. Fresh meat was usually reserved for feast days or special occasions. Hunting could supplement the diet, but in many places, game was the legal property of the nobility, with poaching punishable by severe penalties. Fish might be more accessible, especially if you lived near rivers, lakes, or the sea. Preserved fish, salted, pickled, or dried, was an important food source, particularly during religious fasts when meat was forbidden. The Catholic Church prohibited meat consumption on numerous fast days throughout the year, including every Friday, the 40 days of Lent, and various other observances. This created a significant market for fish and shaped medieval eating patterns. The cooking methods available to you would be limited. Most peasant homes had only one fire for heating and cooking, with perhaps a single pot and a spit or grill. Roasting, boiling, and occasionally frying in animal fat were the primary cooking techniques. The concept of precise cooking times or temperatures was non-existent. Experience and observation guided the cook. Spices that modern people take for granted, black pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, were expensive luxury items imported from distant lands. Your seasoning would come primarily from locally grown herbs and salt, which itself could be costly depending on your location. The absence of refrigeration meant that heavy spicing sometimes served to mask the taste of food that had begun to spoil. As you eat your midday meal, you might notice how different the experience is from modern dining. There are no plates, as we know them. You might eat from a trencher, a piece of stale bread that served as both plate and edible utensil. Wooden or horn spoons would be used for liquid foods, but forks were not yet common implements. Much eating was done with fingers or knives that people carried with them. The food itself would taste very different from its modern counterparts. Medieval grains had different properties than the highly refined varieties we eat today. Vegetables were more bitter, smaller, and less sweet than their modern descendants, which have been selectively bred for palatability. Meat came from animals that lived very different lives than modern livestock, resulting in tougher, leaner flesh with stronger flavors. Your meal would be eaten quickly. There was always more work to be done. The concept of dining as a leisure activity, as something to be savored and enjoyed, was largely reserved for the wealthy. For working people, food was fuel, necessary for survival and labor. After your meal, there would be no brushing of teeth or washing of hands with antibacterial soap. At best, you might rinse your mouth with water or wipe your hands on a cloth. Food particles would remain in your mouth, feeding the bacteria that were already at work on your teeth. Your wooden spoon might get a cursory rinse or wipe before being used again at the next meal. The remains of your food, vegetable trimmings, stale bread too hard to eat, bones and gristle, wouldn't go to waste. They might be fed to domestic animals or added to the compost heap that would eventually fertilize your garden. In a world of scarcity, nothing edible was thrown away carelessly. And now, with your medieval midday meal complete, it's time to return to the fields or workshop for the afternoon's labor. The food has provided calories, but by modern nutritional standards, your diet is deficient in many ways. Vitamin deficiencies, protein shortages, and mineral imbalances were common in medieval populations, contributing to a host of health problems from poor wound healing to developmental issues in children. With a full stomach, but an already tired body, you face at least 5 or 6 more hours of physical labor before the day's end. Modern concepts like food coma or taking a break after lunch have no place in this world. There is only the work, the endless work, that must be completed before darkness falls. Still confident about making it through that single medieval day. The afternoon perils. With your midday meal settling uncomfortably in your stomach, you return to your labor in the afternoon sun. This part of the day brings new challenges. Physical fatigue compounds, the weather intensifies, and the medieval world reveals another layer of hazards that your modern sensibilities have never prepared you for. The afternoon sun beats down relentlessly. There's no SPF 50 sunscreen to protect your skin, no sunglasses to shield your eyes, no breathable moisture-wicking fabrics to keep you cool. Your skin burns and blisters under the direct exposure. Medieval people developed deep tans and leathery skin from lifetimes of outdoor labor. Adaptations your modern skin hasn't built up. Sunstroke and heat exhaustion were common killers. Striking without the victims, understanding what was happening to them. If it's not the sun, perhaps it's rain that plagues your afternoon. There's no Gore-Tex or waterproof clothing, just wool that gets heavier as it absorbs water, or linen that soaks through almost immediately. Your clothes become sodden, chafing against your skin as you continue to work. The mud sucks at your inadequate footwear, making each step an exercise in balance and determination. In medieval Europe, work rarely stopped for weather. The margins of survival were too thin to allow for lost days. As you labor, you become increasingly aware of the dangers around you. Medieval work environments were hazardous in ways that would horrify modern safety inspectors. Agricultural implements were heavy, unwieldy, and prone to causing injury. The curved blade of a scythe could easily slice into flesh with a moment's inattention. The metal head of a hoe or shovel could break off its wooden handle, becoming a dangerous projectile. Animals used for plowing, oxen or horses, were powerful creatures that could injure or kill with a kick or sudden movement. For those working in trades, the dangers were equally present. Blacksmiths worked with red-hot metal without protective gear beyond leather aprons, their eyes and lungs damaged by flying sparks and coal smoke. Carpenters used sharp tools without safety guards, resulting in frequent severe cuts and lost fingers. Tanners handled caustic chemicals that burned skin and created toxic fumes. Weavers developed skeletal deformities from hunching over looms for decades. There were no workers' compensation claims, no disability benefits, no early retirement options. You worked until you couldn't, and then you became dependent on family or parish charity. Even the environment itself presented hazards unknown to modern people. That rustling in the nearby forest edge might be a wolf, still common in medieval Europe and occasionally bold enough to attack humans, especially in winter when game was scarce. Wild boars with their sharp tusks and aggressive temperament were genuinely dangerous encounters. Even domesticated animals posed threats. Bulls gored their handlers, pigs sometimes ate unattended infants, and rabies was a constant concern with all mammals. The plants around you held their own dangers. Without formal education in botany, medieval people learned through community knowledge which plants were safe and which were deadly. Mistakes in identification could be fatal. Water hemlock, belladonna, and foxglove grew wild in many areas, containing toxins that could kill swiftly and painfully. Even medicinal herbs, when improperly used, could cause harm rather than healing. The water sources you might drink from to quench your afternoon thirst were often contaminated. Rivers downstream from towns contained human and animal waste. Wells could be tainted by nearby middens or burial grounds. Springs might contain natural minerals that caused illness. Without understanding germ theory or having access to water treatment, medieval people frequently fell ill from waterborne diseases like dysentery, a particular danger in the warmer months. As the afternoon wears on, insects become another torment. There are no insect repellents beyond smoke or certain strong-smelling herbs. Mosquitoes carry malaria in many parts of Europe, especially in lowland areas with standing water. Flies spread disease from waste to food. Fleas carry the bacteria that cause plague. Lice infest hair and clothing, causing constant itching and sometimes spreading typhus. These weren't merely annoyances. Insect-borne diseases were major killers throughout the medieval period. Even the air you breathe might be dangerous. In areas where certain industries concentrated, tanning, metalworking, or butchery, the air could be filled with toxic substances. Urban areas suffered from smoke pollution as thousands of wood and coal fires burned for cooking and heating. The concept of environmental regulation was centuries away, with noxious industries operating in the midst of residential areas. Social dangers existed alongside physical ones. Medieval communities could be close-knit, but also suspicious and quick to accuse. A misunderstood comment, a perceived slight, or simply being different in some way could lead to ostracism or worse. Accusations of witchcraft, while not as common as popular culture suggests, did occur and could result in execution. Religious conformity was expected and enforced, with heresy punishable by death in many places. For women, additional perils existed. Sexual violence was a reality, with limited legal recourse. Childbirth was extremely dangerous, with high mortality rates for both mothers and infants. Women working alone in fields or forests were vulnerable to assault. Medicine for women's health issues was primitive and often ineffective, with many conditions simply endured rather than treated. As the afternoon progresses, your physical reserves diminish. The hard physical labor, inadequate nutrition, and constant exposure to the elements take their toll. Modern people used to relatively easy physical lives would find their muscles failing, coordination decreasing, and mental focus slipping. This fatigue itself becomes dangerous, increasing the risk of accidents with tools or missteps on uneven ground, and yet, you cannot stop. The work must be completed before darkness falls. There are no floodlights to extend the workday, no machinery to take over the heaviest tasks, only human and animal power pushing against the limits of endurance as the sun begins its slow descent toward the horizon. Medieval people built up lifelong endurance for this work, their bodies conditioned from childhood for these demands. Your modern body, despite perhaps being better nourished and more disease-free, lacks this specific conditioning. The physical reserves needed to endure a full day of medieval labor simply aren't there. By mid-afternoon, you would likely be reaching your breaking point, while your medieval counterparts continue their steady pace, conserving energy and moving with the efficiency of long practice. The afternoon wears on, and your chances of surviving this single medieval day grow more uncertain with each passing hour. Physical exhaustion, environmental hazards, workplace dangers, and the constant risk of accident or illness surround you. And the day is far from over. There are still hours of work ahead before you can rest. Still believe you'd make it through the single medieval day. The most challenging hours are yet to come. The evening return. As the sun begins its descent toward the horizon, your medieval workday doesn't end. It merely transitions. Fields and workshops gradually empty as laborers head homeward, their bodies exhausted from a day of constant physical exertion. This journey home isn't the relaxing commute of modern life. No car radio playing your favorite tunes, no podcast to distract you from traffic, no climate-controlled environment to ease your transition. Just more walking on tired feet, carrying the tools of your trade. The dirt paths that serve as roads are rutted from cartwheels and livestock, challenging to navigate even for those familiar with them. After rain, these paths become mudslicks where each step requires careful attention to avoid falls. In dry weather, they kick up choking dust with every footfall. There are no streetlights, no reflective markers, no smooth paved surfaces, just uneven ground that grows more treacherous as daylight fades. Your body aches in ways you've never experienced. Modern people might understand muscle fatigue from a vigorous workout or a weekend of yard work, but this is different. This is the bone-deep weariness that comes from using every muscle group continuously for 10 or 12 hours with minimal rest. Your shoulders burn from lifting, your back throbs from bending, your hands are blistered from gripping tools, and your feet feel as though you've walked across hot coals in paper shoes. The walk home offers a moment to assess the damage to your body. Those blisters on your palms have broken, the raw flesh now caked with dirt that burns with every motion. Your lower back sends sharp pains up your spine with each step. The muscles in your arms and legs tremble with fatigue. Your skin is sunburned and salt-crusted from dried sweat. Every joint seems to creak and protest. And this isn't unusual. This is simply the daily experience of medieval labor. As you approach your village, you notice the smoke rising from dozens of small homes as evening fires are lit for cooking and meager warmth. The smell of wood smoke mingles with the less pleasant odors of animal waste, rotting garbage, and human effluent. Medieval villages had no sanitation systems, no garbage collection, no sewers. Waste was simply thrown outside, creating a perpetual miasma that modern noses would find overwhelming. The communal animals are being brought in from pasture: pigs, sheep, possibly a few cattle owned collectively by the village. Their handlers drive them through the narrow paths between dwellings, creating momentary chaos as chickens scatter and children dart out of the way. These animals aren't just livestock. They're wealth, food security, sources of milk, wool, and labor. Their well-being is essential to survival, which is why many would be brought into human dwellings at night, creating the mixed-species households that would shock modern sensibilities. Children play in the dirt streets, their games improvised from sticks, stones, and imagination. There are no plastic toys, no electronic devices, no specially designed playgrounds with safety features. Their clothing is identical to adult clothing, just smaller. Medieval children weren't dressed differently from their parents. Many show signs of nutritional deficiencies, slightly bow-legged from rickets, thin, with discolored teeth, and sores that heal slowly. Yet they laugh and shout, adaptable as children have always been. You pass the village church, the only stone building most peasants would ever enter. Its small bell tower dominates the settlement, the bells marking time in a world without clocks. The churchyard contains the graves of generations, some marked with simple wooden crosses, others with just a mound of earth. The church was the center of medieval community life, not just for religious services, but for social gatherings, announcements, and the administration of what passed for justice. Finally, you reach your home, the same one-room dwelling you left this morning. The fire has been maintained throughout the day, likely by elderly family members or young children who stayed behind while others worked the fields. The smoke still hangs in the air, but the small warmth it provides is welcome as evening coolness begins to settle. This fire is precious. Starting a new one, without modern matches or lighters, was a skill requiring practice and the right materials. Many homes kept their fires burning continuously, banking them at night to preserve embers for morning. Now comes the evening meal preparation. Again, this bears little resemblance to modern cooking. There's no stopping at the grocery store on the way home, no takeout when you're too tired to cook, no microwave to reheat leftovers. The evening meal must be prepared from scratch with whatever ingredients are available. This often means more pottage, that ever-present staple of medieval cooking, perhaps with additions different from the midday meal. The work isn't done when you reach home. There are evening chores that can't be neglected. Animals must be fed and secured for the night. Water must be drawn from the well for cooking and minimal washing. Tools must be cleaned and stored for tomorrow's use. Firewood must be brought in, perhaps split into smaller pieces. The interior of the dwelling needs attention. Fresh rushes spread on the floor, bedding rearranged, the cooking area prepared. For those with specialized skills or crafts, evening hours might be spent on essential household production. Women would spin thread using drop spindles or spinning wheels, a near constant activity whenever hands were free. Men might repair tools, carve wooden implements, or work on home repairs. Children would be assigned tasks appropriate to their age and strength, gathering eggs, feeding smaller animals, sorting beans or grains, learning the skills they would need for survival. As darkness falls, the interior of your medieval home grows dimmer. Lighting is precious and expensive. Candles made from beeswax or tallow animal fat were too costly for everyday use by common people. Instead, you might have a rush light, a rush reed that has been soaked in fat and then lit, providing minimal illumination. Or perhaps a simple oil lamp, a shallow container filled with animal fat or oil with a floating wick. These light sources were smoky, smelly, and dangerous, always threatening to ignite the flammable materials of your home. The darkness shapes the rhythm of medieval life. When the sun sets, activities requiring good vision largely cease. Modern people, surrounded by electric lighting that turns night into artificial day, have forgotten what true darkness feels like, the enveloping blackness that our ancestors knew intimately. This darkness was filled with sounds and imagined threats, feeding the rich folklore of spirits, demons, and supernatural beings that populated medieval belief systems. Before sleep, there might be a brief time for family interaction. Stories might be told, not read, as books were rare and literacy rarer still among common people. These would be tales passed orally through generations, often containing practical knowledge disguised as entertainment. Religious teachings might be recited, prayers spoken aloud, news from neighboring villages might be shared, or gossip about local events. This was medieval entertainment. No television, no internet, no books or board games for most families. Your day of medieval survival is nearing its end. Your body aches. Your stomach is likely still partly empty. Despite the day's meals, your skin itches from dirt and insect bites, and your home offers minimal comfort by modern standards. Yet, this was normal for the vast majority of people throughout the medieval period. They didn't know about antibiotics or indoor plumbing or balanced nutrition. They simply lived the lives they were born into, finding small joys where possible and enduring hardships that were simply part of existence. As you prepare for sleep, consider once more. Could your modern self truly survive this single day in medieval Europe? And this was just an ordinary day, not one with additional challenges like illness, injury, warfare, or natural disaster. The people who lived through the medieval period weren't fundamentally different from us biologically, but they were conditioned to a level of hardship and discomfort that modern people can scarcely imagine. The night hours. As darkness fully envelops your medieval dwelling, the final phase of your day begins. A night unlike any you've experienced in the modern world. There's no flipping a switch for instant illumination. No television to watch until drowsiness sets in. No scrolling through social media until your eyes grow heavy. Medieval night is a different entity altogether. Darker, more mysterious, and filled with its own set of challenges. Your sleeping arrangements would be rudimentary by modern standards. The bed, if you have one, might be a simple wooden frame with ropes or leather strips stretched across it to provide support. On top of this would be the mattress, typically a sack filled with straw or perhaps wool if you were more prosperous. No memory foam, no spring coils, not even cotton stuffing. The straw would be lumpy, rustling with every movement, and gradually compressing through use until it needed replacement. You wouldn't sleep alone. Privacy was not a medieval concept when it came to sleeping arrangements. An entire family, parents, children, possibly grandparents or other relatives, would share the same sleeping space, often the same bed. Body heat was valuable in cold seasons, and separate bedrooms were a luxury few could afford. Even in larger homes with multiple rooms, people typically slept together for warmth and security. Your bedding would consist of coarse wool blankets or perhaps linen sheets for the less poor. These wouldn't be changed and laundered weekly. Washing bedding was a major undertaking requiring significant labor. Your sheets might be washed a few times a year at most. In winter, additional layers might include furs or more wool blankets, or perhaps a feather comforter in wealthier households. Many people simply slept in their day clothes for added warmth, removing only outer layers. Before sleep, you might engage in a brief bedtime routine, though nothing like the elaborate skincare regimens or hot showers of the modern world. You might rinse your mouth with water, perhaps with a bit of vinegar or salt added if available. You might quickly wash your hands and face with cold water from a basin. You would not brush your teeth. Toothbrushes as we know them didn't exist in medieval Europe. At best, you might rub your teeth with a cloth, or use a chewed twig as a sort of primitive tooth-cleaning tool. As you settle onto your straw mattress, you become acutely aware of its inhabitants. You are not the only living being in this bed. Fleas and bedbugs were nearly universal companions in medieval sleeping arrangements. These parasites lived in the straw, in the wooden frame, in the bedding itself, emerging at night to feed on human blood. Their bites would cause itching, welts, and occasionally disease transmission. Modern people, unused to this constant parasitic companionship, would find sleep nearly impossible amid the biting and crawling sensations. The night air inside your dwelling would be of questionable quality. With the fire banked for the night, smoke would still hang in the air. In winter, when doors and windows were kept closed against the cold, this smoky, stale air could become truly oppressive. In summer, open doors or windows might provide some relief, but would also admit mosquitoes and other insects. The concept of fresh air for sleeping was largely unknown. Night air was considered dangerous in many medieval belief systems, thought to carry disease. Sounds would accompany your attempts at sleep. The rustling of straw as family members shifted position. The breathing, snoring, and occasional talking or crying out of those sleeping nearby. Outside, the village would not be completely quiet. Livestock animals might make noise throughout the night, dogs might bark at real or imagined threats, and the occasional human voice might be heard as someone tended to animals or returned late from an errand. Natural sounds would be more prominent than in our noise-polluted modern world. The wind in trees, owls calling, wolves howling in more remote areas, the scurrying of rodents in the thatch above. These sounds formed the backdrop of medieval nights, sometimes comforting in their familiarity, sometimes causing alarm when unusual. Sleep itself would follow different patterns than modern sleep. Without artificial lighting extending the day, medieval people typically went to bed soon after sunset and rose with the dawn, a sleep schedule more closely aligned with natural light cycles than our modern habits. However, evidence suggests that first sleep and second sleep were common. People would sleep for several hours, then wake for an hour or so during the night, using this time for contemplation, quiet conversation, or even visiting neighbors before returning to second sleep until dawn. Physical discomfort would impact your sleep quality. The hard surfaces, the lack of pillows as we know them, perhaps a rolled cloth or small straw-stuffed sack instead, the inability to regulate temperature effectively, all these would make deep, restful sleep more difficult to achieve. Chronic pain from labor, untreated medical conditions, and dental issues would further diminish sleep quality. The medieval person was likely accustomed to a level of discomfort during sleep that would keep most modern people awake. True darkness would surround you, a level of darkness few modern people ever experience. With no street lights, no electronic device standby lights, no distant city glow, the darkness in a medieval dwelling would be nearly complete when the fire died down. This darkness had spiritual and psychological dimensions in medieval thought. The night was when demons, spirits, and supernatural beings were believed to be most active. Prayers before sleep were not just religious observance, but spiritual protection against these nocturnal threats. The night held very real dangers beyond the supernatural. Fire was perhaps the most feared. A knocked-over rushlight, or a spark from the banked fire could set a thatch roof or straw bedding ablaze, with catastrophic results. Medieval villages and towns regularly experienced devastating fires that could consume dozens or hundreds of homes in a single night. With no fire departments, limited water sources, and highly flammable building materials. Fire prevention was essential but not always successful. Human threats existed as well. While violent crime rates in medieval Europe were not as high as popular culture sometimes suggests, theft and home invasion did occur. Most homes had simple latches rather than locks, and windows, if they existed, were not secured as in modern homes. Some urban areas maintained night watches, but rural villages had little organized protection. The vulnerability of sleep was one reason for communal living arrangements. More people meant more potential defenders if threatened. Health emergencies that occurred during night hours were especially dangerous. With no telephones to call for help, no emergency services to respond, and limited medical knowledge, a sudden illness or injury during the night often meant suffering until morning, if the afflicted person survived that long. The night magnified the isolation and self-reliance of medieval life. For women, childbirth often began or progressed during night hours, adding another layer of danger and fear to medieval nights. Birth was handled at home with the assistance of midwives or female relatives, by the limited light of candles or rushlights. Complications that would be quickly addressed in modern hospitals could be fatal, for both mother and child. As the night progresses, you might wake several times from discomfort, from parasites, from the sounds of others nearby, or from the cold as the fire dies down. Each waking might require adjustment, stoking the fire if it's winter, shifting position to relieve pressure points on your body, perhaps stepping outside briefly to relieve yourself. Chamber pots were used at night, but not always by everyone. The approach of dawn would be noticeable first by sounds rather than sight: roosters crowing, birds beginning their morning songs, early rising villagers moving about, church bells marking the first canonical hour. The medieval day began early, with many people rising before full daylight, especially in winter, when daylight hours were precious for necessary work. And so your night in medieval Europe would end as it began, with discomfort, limited rest, and physical challenges unknown to modern sleepers on their pillow-top mattresses with climate control and sound machines. The medieval person would rise from this inadequate rest to face another day of physical labor, accepting this pattern as simply the nature of existence. Could you, modern person, truly endure this night, only to face another day of medieval reality? Or would the accumulated hardships, physical, psychological, and environmental, already have proven too much? The hidden killers. As you've navigated a day and night in medieval Europe, you've encountered numerous obvious challenges: the physical labor, the inadequate food, the uncomfortable sleeping arrangements. But perhaps the most dangerous aspects of medieval life were the ones you couldn't see: the invisible threats that claimed countless lives throughout the period. These hidden killers would pose perhaps the greatest threat to your survival, even within that single day. Microscopic pathogens lurked everywhere in the medieval world. Without germ theory, without understanding of sanitation, medieval people unwittingly created perfect conditions for disease transmission. Water sources were routinely contaminated with human and animal waste. Food was prepared without knowledge of safe handling practices. Wounds were treated without sterilization. The results were predictable and devastating. Gastrointestinal diseases were perhaps the most common killers. Dysentery, caused by bacteria or parasites in contaminated water or food, brought debilitating diarrhea that could kill through dehydration, especially in children and the elderly. What modern people might experience as an uncomfortable bout of food poisoning could be a death sentence in medieval Europe. The simple act of drinking water, something modern people do without thought, was a potential pathway to illness or death. Wells were often dug too close to latrines or animal pens. Rivers and streams received human waste from settlements upstream. Even rainwater, collected for household use, could become contaminated in storage. This is why alcoholic beverages were so important in medieval society. The fermentation process killed many pathogens, making ale or wine often safer to drink than water. Parasitic infections were nearly universal. Intestinal worms, roundworms, tapeworms, hookworms, infected a large percentage of the population, causing nutrient deficiencies, abdominal pain, and sometimes fatal complications. These parasites entered the body through contaminated food or water, or through bare feet in contaminated soil. Without effective medications, people simply lived with these unwelcome internal companions, sometimes for their entire lives. External parasites were equally problematic. Lice infested hair and clothing, causing constant itching and sometimes transmitting more serious diseases like typhus. Fleas carried bubonic plague, responsible for the devastating Black Death pandemic that killed 30 to 60% of Europe's population in the mid-14th century. Ticks spread fevers and debilitating conditions. These creatures were not occasional visitors but constant companions for most medieval people. Respiratory infections claimed countless lives. Without antibiotics, a simple cold could progress to pneumonia, especially in the young, the elderly, or those weakened by malnutrition or other illnesses. Tuberculosis, known variously as consumption, phthisis, or the White Plague, was endemic, spreading easily in crowded, poorly ventilated dwellings. The chronic cough you might have noticed in your household would likely be tuberculosis slowly destroying someone's lungs. Children faced particularly high mortality rates from infectious diseases. Measles, smallpox, diphtheria, and whooping cough swept through communities regularly, leaving devastation in their wake. Parents expected to lose children, perhaps half would survive to adulthood in some periods and regions. This reality shaped medieval attitudes toward childhood and grief in ways modern people struggle to comprehend. Women faced additional health risks. Childbirth was extraordinarily dangerous, with maternal mortality rates estimated at 1 to 2% per birth, given that women might experience 10 or more pregnancies during their reproductive years. The cumulative lifetime risk was substantial. Infections following birth, puerperal fever, hemorrhage, obstructed labor, and eclampsia were common killers, leaving many children motherless and many families broken. Dental infections, barely considered life-threatening in the modern world, regularly led to death in medieval Europe. Without professional dental care, cavities would progress to abscesses, which could then spread infection to the bloodstream or brain. The excruciating pain of advanced dental disease is almost unknown in developed countries today, but was a common experience in medieval life, sometimes ending in fatal sepsis. Nutritional deficiencies undermined health in subtle but critical ways. Vitamin C deficiency, scurvy was common in winter and early spring when fresh fruits and vegetables were unavailable, leading to bleeding gums, joint pain, poor wound healing, and eventually, death if not addressed. Vitamin D deficiency caused rickets in children, with characteristic bowed legs and skeletal deformities. Vitamin A deficiency led to night blindness and increased susceptibility to infections. Iron deficiency anemia was widespread, especially among women of childbearing age, causing weakness, fatigue, and complications during pregnancy. The medieval diet, while sometimes adequate in calories, at least in good harvest years, was often seriously imbalanced. It was heavy in grains, providing carbohydrates, but lacking complete proteins and many micronutrients. Preservation methods like salting and smoking could make food safe from spoilage, but also destroyed some nutrients. Seasonal availability meant that winter diets were particularly restricted and problematic from a nutritional standpoint. Mental health challenges received no effective treatment. Depression, anxiety, psychosis, and developmental disorders all existed, but were often attributed to spiritual causes, demon possession, divine punishment, or moral failing. Treatments ranged from ineffective to actively harmful: exorcism, physical restraint, bloodletting, or consumption of various herbal or mineral preparations that could be toxic. Those suffering from serious mental illness might be cared for by family if possible, but were often relegated to the margins of society, with some eventually dying from neglect, exposure, or suicide. Chronic pain was simply endured. Arthritis, back problems from years of physical labor, old injuries that never properly healed, all these were considered normal parts of aging. Pain management consisted primarily of alcohol, herbal preparations of varying effectiveness, and perhaps primitive forms of heat or cold therapy. The constant background of pain shaped medieval psychology and spirituality, with suffering often given religious meaning as a test of faith or opportunity for spiritual growth. Cancer, heart disease, and other conditions we now consider major health concerns existed in medieval populations, but were poorly understood and rarely diagnosed as specific entities. They might be lumped together under terms like wasting sickness, or attributed to imbalances in the four humors that were believed to regulate health. Without effective treatments, people simply declined until death, often after extended suffering. Injuries that modern medicine would consider relatively minor could become life-threatening. A simple cut could develop into an infected wound, leading to sepsis. A broken bone might heal improperly, causing permanent disability. Burns, common in a world where open fires were the primary source of heating and cooking, frequently became infected, and could be fatal if extensive. The lack of antiseptics, antibiotics, and surgical expertise meant that physical trauma of any kind carried significant risk. Perhaps most insidious were the environmental toxins that medieval people unknowingly exposed themselves to daily. Lead was present in glazed pottery, used for food storage and serving, leaching into acidic foods and drinks. Some cosmetics contained lead, mercury, or arsenic. Ergot, a fungus that grows on rye and other grains in damp conditions, caused hallucinations, gangrene, and death when consumed in bread made from contaminated flour. Carbon monoxide poisoning from poorly ventilated heating fires claimed lives every winter. Even the treatments that medieval medicine offered often caused more harm than good. Bloodletting, one of the most common medical interventions, was based on the flawed humoral theory and typically weakened patients already fighting illness. Purgatives and emetics, designed to expel perceived harmful substances from the body, could cause dangerous dehydration. Herbal remedies, while sometimes effective, were prepared without standardization, leading to inconsistent potency and occasional toxicity. All these invisible threats surrounded you during your medieval day. Every breath, every drink of water, every bite of food, every human contact carried potential dangers that your medieval counterparts accepted as simply part of existence. Their immune systems, exposed to these pathogens from birth, may have developed some resistance to local disease strains. Your modern immune system, accustomed to clean water, refrigerated food, and antibiotics, would be overwhelmed by this onslaught of microscopic invaders. So, as you consider whether you could survive a single day in medieval Europe, remember that the greatest threats weren't the obvious hardships, the physical labor, the uncomfortable bed, the bland food. The greatest dangers were the ones you couldn't see. The bacteria in the water, the parasites in the straw. The viruses passed through a simple handshake or shared cup. These were the true killers of medieval Europe, claiming lives indiscriminately from peasant huts to royal palaces. Your modern knowledge of germ theory would provide little protection without the infrastructure and technology to apply it. Knowing that boiling water kills pathogens doesn't help when you have no clean container to store it in afterward. Understanding that wounds should be cleaned provides little benefit without antiseptics. In the medieval world, invisible dangers lurked everywhere, and neither knowledge nor wealth offered complete protection. The social order. As you've moved through your medieval day, you've primarily experienced the physical realities of the period. The labor, the food, the discomfort. But medieval Europe wasn't just a collection of material conditions, it was a complex social system that would feel profoundly alien to modern sensibilities. This social order shaped every aspect of life, determining not just how you lived, but who you fundamentally were in the eyes of society and law. The medieval world operated on principles of hierarchy, immobility, and divine ordination. The social structure wasn't just a practical arrangement, it was believed to reflect God's will for human society. Each person was born into a specific social position, and in most cases would remain in that position for life. Social mobility, as we understand it today, was extremely limited and often viewed with suspicion. At the top of this rigid hierarchy stood the nobility, comprising perhaps 1 to 2% of the population. Nobles owned the land, controlled military power, and dominated political life. Their position was justified by concepts of bloodline and inherited virtue, the belief that noble families were inherently superior, destined by birth to rule over others. This tiny elite lived in a different world from common people, with different food, clothing, education, and legal rights. The clergy formed another elite group, operating parallel to the secular nobility. Religious leaders wielded enormous influence, controlling education, providing the theological justification for the social order, and administering what passed for social services. Within the clergy itself was another hierarchy, from powerful bishops and abbots who lived like nobility down to humble parish priests who might be barely literate and nearly as poor as their parishioners. Below these elites were the common people, divided into further subcategories. Urban craftspeople and merchants formed a small middle stratum, sometimes achieving modest wealth but rarely true power. Skilled craft workers organized into guilds that controlled training, quality standards, and market access. These guilds provided some security for their members but also restricted competition and innovation. At the bottom of the social pyramid, comprising the vast majority of the population, were the peasants, further divided into free tenants, villeins, serfs bound to the land, and in some regions, outright slaves. These distinctions mattered enormously in medieval law and practice. A free peasant could move, marry, or change occupation without permission. A serf could not leave the lord's land, marry, or even slaughter a cow without approval, and owed labor services to the lord in addition to rent. For most of the medieval period, the majority of people were serfs, not slaves in the strict sense, but far from free by modern standards. They had certain customary rights that could not be violated even by lords, but they were fundamentally unfree, tied to the land and subject to the authority of their social superiors. This status was hereditary. The children of serfs were born serfs, with little hope of changing their condition. This rigid social structure was justified and reinforced by the Church, which taught that the three estates, those who pray clergy, those who fight nobility, and those who work commoners, were ordained by God. Each person had their assigned role in the divine plan. To rebel against this arrangement was not just a crime against the social order, but a sin against divine will. This religious sanction gave the medieval hierarchy a power and persistence that purely secular arrangements might have lacked. Your place in this hierarchy would determine nearly everything about your life: what you could wear. Sumptuary laws restricted certain clothing to specific social classes, what you could eat, who you could marry, how you could speak to others, where you could live, what occupations were open to you, and even how the law applied to you. Justice was not blind in medieval Europe. Nobles, clergy, and commoners faced different legal systems, different punishments for the same crimes, and different standards of evidence. Social interactions followed strict protocols that reinforced hierarchy. Peasants were expected to show deference to their social superiors through specific gestures, forms of address, and behaviors. Failing to remove your hat, bow appropriately, or use the correct honorific when addressing a noble could result in punishment. These weren't just matters of etiquette, but expressions of the fundamental social order. Medieval people didn't think of themselves primarily as individuals in the modern sense. Identity was collective, defined by family, village, guild, religious affiliation, and social class. The concepts of individual rights, personal fulfillment, or finding yourself would have seemed strange or even dangerous to medieval thinkers. You were who you were born to be, fulfilling the role assigned to you by Providence. Marriage was not a personal choice based on romantic attraction, but an economic and social arrangement negotiated between families. For peasants, marriage partners were typically chosen from the same village or a neighboring one, often with consideration for combining compatible landholdings or skills. For the nobility, marriages were political alliances, sometimes arranged in childhood. The concept of marrying for love alone would have seemed irresponsible and self-indulgent to most medieval people. Children were viewed differently as well. Childhood as a protected time of play and education is largely a modern invention. In medieval Europe, children were simply small adults, expected to contribute to family survival as soon as physically capable. By age 7, most children were performing significant work. Adolescence as a distinct life phase didn't exist. Puberty marked the transition directly to adulthood, with apprenticeships beginning and marriages sometimes occurring in the early teens. Education, where it existed at all, reinforced the social hierarchy. Formal schooling was primarily for boys destined for the church, or, in some cases, for administrative positions. The vast majority of the population received no formal education and remained illiterate throughout their lives. Knowledge was transmitted orally, through practical apprenticeship, or through the rituals and symbols of the church. This limited access to education ensured that power remained concentrated in the hands of those who could read, write, and manipulate abstract concepts. Community was simultaneously more important and more constraining than in modern society. Your village wasn't just where you lived, it was your social security system, your entertainment, your protection, and your identity. But it was also a place of intense social surveillance, where deviation from norms could result in ostracism or worse. Medieval communities could show remarkable solidarity in times of hardship, but could also turn quickly against those perceived as threatening community welfare or values. Religious practice wasn't a personal choice, but a community obligation. Attendance at Mass wasn't optional for most people. Absence would be noted and could lead to suspicion or censure. Religious festivals and observances structured the year, providing rare breaks from labor, but also reinforcing communal identity and spiritual beliefs. The church calendar determined when you could marry, what you could eat, when you could celebrate, and countless other aspects of daily life. For women, the constraints of the social order were particularly stringent. Women were considered legally subordinate to men, first fathers, then husbands. They had limited property rights, restricted access to most occupations, and virtually no political voice. While realities on the ground were sometimes more complex than legal theories suggested, women did run businesses, manage estates, and wield influence in various ways. The fundamental inequality was built into every level of medieval society. Outsiders of various kinds faced suspicion or outright persecution. Religious minorities, like Jews, lived in segregated communities, subject to special taxes, restrictions on occupation, and occasional violence. Those with physical differences or mental illnesses might be viewed as cursed or touched by supernatural forces. Strangers were automatically suspect in tight-knit communities where everyone knew everyone else. Even language reinforced social divisions. How you spoke, your vocabulary, grammar, and accent immediately marked your social position. The nobility in many regions spoke a different language entirely from the peasantry. Norman French versus English in post-conquest England, for example. Specialized vocabulary in trades, crafts, and religious contexts created further linguistic divisions that reinforced social boundaries. Justice was local, personal, and often arbitrary by modern standards. In many rural areas, the local lord's court handled most disputes and crimes. Trials might involve ordeals, tests believed to reveal divine judgment, rather than evidence in the modern sense. Punishments were often public and designed to shame as much as to cause physical pain. The stocks, the pillory, public flogging. The concept of rehabilitation was largely absent. Punishment was about deterrence, retribution, and purification of the community. As you moved through your medieval day, every interaction would be shaped by these social realities. The deference you showed to the local priest, or the Lord's representative, the carefully calibrated greetings exchanged with others of your social level, the communal nature of work and meals, all reflected a world organized around principles fundamentally different from modern individualism, mobility, and theoretical equality. For a modern person, this social order might be the most difficult aspect of medieval life to adapt to, more challenging even than the physical hardships. We are accustomed to thinking of ourselves as autonomous individuals with inherent rights and the ability to shape our own destinies. The medieval mind would find these assumptions not just unfamiliar, but potentially dangerous threats to the divinely ordained structure that gave meaning to existence. Could you, modern person with your ingrained assumptions about personal choice, individual rights, and social mobility, truly function within this rigid hierarchy? Or would you find yourself constantly at odds with a world where your place was predetermined, your individuality subordinated to collective identities, and the very concept of equality foreign to the prevailing worldview, the religious mind? While you've now experienced the physical conditions and social structures of medieval Europe, there's another dimension of medieval life perhaps even more alien to modern sensibilities, the religious worldview that permeated every aspect of existence. To truly understand whether you could survive a day in medieval times, you must grasp how fundamentally different the medieval mind was in its understanding of reality itself. Religion in medieval Europe wasn't merely a set of beliefs or weekly practices, it was the lens through which all reality was understood. The medieval worldview was deeply supernatural, with God, angels, saints, demons, and other spiritual beings perceived as active participants in daily life. The modern distinction between natural and supernatural would have made little sense to medieval people. Both were simply aspects of a divinely created reality. This supernatural understanding extended to everything from weather patterns to human illness. A sudden storm might be divine punishment for community sin. A child's fever could be attributed to demonic influence. Crop failure might indicate God's displeasure. Even routine physical events had spiritual significance and moral implications. Modern scientific explanation, germs causing disease, weather as atmospheric physics, would have seemed not just incomplete, but actually missing the true causation, divine will. Time itself was understood differently. The medieval calendar revolved around religious observances, feast days, saints' days, fasting periods, like Lent and Advent. These weren't just ceremonies but cosmic events, moments when the boundary between heaven and earth grew thin, when saints and their holy power became more accessible. Each day of the year had its own spiritual character and associated practices or prohibitions. Church bells marked the hours of the day, dividing time according to canonical hours: matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline. These regular calls to prayer structured daily life for everyone, not just monks and nuns. Prayer was woven into daily activities, crossing oneself before eating, murmuring brief devotions when passing a shrine or church, reciting simple prayers while working. The physical landscape was imbued with spiritual meaning. Churches dominated village skylines, their spires symbolically connecting earth and heaven. Roadside shrines, crosses at crossroads, holy wells, and pilgrimage routes created a sacred geography. These weren't just landmarks, but points of access to divine power, places where prayers might be more effective or healing more likely. Heaven and hell were not abstract concepts, but vivid realities in the medieval imagination. Church art depicted the torments of hell and the bliss of heaven in graphic detail, visible even to the illiterate. The fate of the soul after death was the ultimate concern, with the constant awareness that any day could be one's last, and judgment would follow. This gave an urgency to spiritual matters that's difficult for many modern people to comprehend. Satan and his demons weren't metaphors for human evil, but real entities actively working to corrupt souls. Temptation wasn't just internal psychological struggle but actual demonic whispers trying to lead humans astray. The world was a battlefield between good and evil forces, with human souls as the prize. Spiritual protection, prayer, blessed objects, holy water, the sign of the cross was as essential to survival as food and shelter. Saints were not distant historical figures, but powerful intercessors who could be called upon for specific needs. Saint Christopher protected travelers, Saint Barbara guarded against sudden death, Saint Blaise healed throat ailments. Each occupation, region, and malady had its patron saint, creating a vast supernatural support network that medieval people navigated with practiced familiarity. The sacraments were not symbolic rituals, but actual channels of divine grace, necessary for salvation. Baptism didn't just mark entry into the Christian community, it literally washed away original sin. The Eucharist wasn't a memorial meal, but the actual body and blood of Christ, physically present under the appearance of bread and wine. Confession absolved sins that would otherwise condemn the soul to hell. These weren't matters of abstract theology, but vital spiritual necessities. Religious knowledge wasn't transmitted primarily through texts. Most people couldn't read, but through sermons, art, music, and ritual. Church walls were covered with biblical scenes and saints' lives, creating a visual catechism accessible to all. Religious plays dramatized salvation history. Hymns and chants embedded theological concepts in memorable form. The liturgical year physically enacted the Christian narrative through seasonal practices and celebrations. Heresy was not simply theological disagreement, but a dangerous spiritual contagion that threatened the community's salvation. Those who questioned established doctrine weren't expressing alternative viewpoints, but potentially damning themselves and others to eternal torment. The medieval concern with rooting out heresy, which can seem like intolerance to modern observers, reflected a genuine belief that false teaching endangered souls eternally. Magic and religion occupied a complex, blurry boundary in medieval thought. While the Church officially condemned sorcery and witchcraft, many popular religious practices included elements we might now classify as magical thinking: blessed herbs for healing, prayers with specific ritualized wording, protective amulets containing saints' relics. The line between approved religious practice and forbidden magic was often unclear and inconsistently enforced. The natural world was filled with moral lessons and divine messages. Animals had symbolic meanings. The pelican represented Christ's sacrifice. The fox suggested cunning and deceit. Plants, stars, and minerals each had spiritual properties and correspondences. Reading these signs was part of understanding God's creation. Nothing was just physical. Everything pointed beyond itself to spiritual truths. Sin wasn't a private matter, but had communal consequences. Individual wrongdoing could bring divine punishment on the entire community, creating a strong impetus for social conformity and mutual surveillance. Public penance for serious transgressions wasn't just about individual redemption, but about restoring the community's spiritual balance and appeasing divine wrath. Death was omnipresent in medieval consciousness, not hidden away as in modern society. High mortality rates, frequent plagues, and public executions made death a familiar sight. The good death, passing away with time to confess sins and receive last rites, was a central concern. The ancient Christian prayer, "From sudden and unprovided death, O Lord, deliver us," reflected the fear of dying unprepared spiritually, potentially resulting in eternal damnation. Purgatory, a middle state between heaven and hell, where souls were purified through suffering before entering paradise, was a powerful concept in medieval Christianity. The living could ease the suffering of their dead loved ones through prayers, masses, and good works offered on their behalf, creating an ongoing relationship between the living and the dead. This wasn't abstract theology, but a practical concern, motivating countless bequests for perpetual masses and charitable foundations. The physical and spiritual worlds interpenetrated in ways difficult for modern minds to grasp. Relics, physical remains of saints or objects associated with them, contained actual spiritual power that could heal, protect, or punish. Blessed bread, water, or salt carried tangible divine energy. Places could be inherently holy or cursed. Material objects could be vessels of spiritual reality. Prayer wasn't just psychological comfort or ritual obligation, but an effective action that changed outcomes in the world. Medieval people prayed with the expectation that their words, properly offered, would produce results: healing, protection, good weather for crops, victory in battle. Prayer was practical technology for navigating a dangerous world. Miracles weren't violations of natural law, a concept that would have made little sense, but manifestations of a higher order of reality breaking through. They were uncommon but not unnatural in the modern sense. Reports of miraculous events, healing, apparitions, divine punishment were received not with modern skepticism, but with varying degrees of careful evaluation within an overall framework that expected divine intervention. The afterlife was not a vague better place, but an elaborately structured realm with specific characteristics. Medieval visions and theology detailed the architecture of heaven, hell, and purgatory with geographical precision. These weren't understood as metaphorical descriptions, but as accurate, if limited, glimpses of spiritual reality. Your actions in this brief earthly life determined your eternal placement in this cosmic order. For modern people, accustomed to material explanations, psychological interpretations, and the separation of religious belief from daily life, the medieval religious mind can seem alien or even superstitious. But this perspective misunderstands the fundamental nature of medieval thought. The supernatural vision wasn't an addition to normal reality, but the basic framework through which all experience was processed. Could you, modern person, truly enter this mindset? Could you navigate a world where physical processes had moral meanings, where invisible beings affected daily events, where ritual actions had tangible power, and where your eternal destiny hung in the balance with each decision? Could you feel the weight of spiritual reality pressing on every moment of existence, as real and immediate as hunger or cold? This religious consciousness might be the most challenging aspect of medieval life for a modern time traveler to adapt to, more difficult than the physical hardships or social constraints. Without it, you would fundamentally misunderstand the world you were inhabiting, missing the underlying connections and meanings that made sense of medieval existence. You wouldn't just be in a different place, you would be operating with a different model of reality itself. A day of constant danger. Throughout our journey through medieval life, we've explored various aspects of daily existence: the labor, the food, the social order, the religious mindset. But underlying everything was a fundamental reality of medieval life that modern people rarely experience: the constant presence of danger. Every hour brought risks that modern safety systems, medical care, and technology have largely eliminated from our experience. From the moment you woke on that straw mattress, your medieval day was an obstacle course of potential disasters. The simple act of lighting or tending the fire carried significant risk. Without matches or lighters, fire starting involved flint, steel, and tinder, a process requiring skill and care. Once lit, that open flame in your dwelling posed a constant fire hazard. A stray spark could ignite the straw on the floor, the thatch overhead, or your clothing. With structures built primarily of wood, straw, and other flammable materials, house fires could spread rapidly, often consuming entire villages or sections of towns. The cooking fire that prepared your food brought its own dangers. Burns were common, from minor scalds to life-threatening injuries. Cooking vessels, heavy iron pots or ceramic containers, could break or tip, causing injuries or destroying precious food. Smoke inhalation in poorly ventilated dwellings contributed to respiratory problems, especially for those who spent the most time indoors, often women, the very young, and the elderly. Your food itself might kill you. Without refrigeration or modern understanding of food safety, foodborne illness was rampant. Meat and fish spoiled quickly. Grain stored for winter might develop deadly molds. Water sources could be contaminated with human waste or animal carcasses. Even knowing these risks, medieval people had limited options. Hunger couldn't be postponed until safe food was available. The tools of daily labor were hazardous by modern standards. Scythe, pitchforks, hammers, axes, all could cause serious injury through misuse, material failure, or simple fatigue. Working with draft animals added another layer of risk. A horse's kick or an ox's sudden movement could be fatal. These dangers weren't occasional. They were faced every day through long hours of physically demanding work. Travel, even short distances, involved significant risk. Roads were poorly maintained, often becoming impassable mud pits after rain. Bridges might collapse without warning. Bandits targeted travelers in less populated areas. Getting lost was a genuine danger in a world without maps, signs, or GPS. Even if you knew the way, traveling after dark was perilous without adequate lighting. A broken ankle from a stumble on an uneven path might not just mean inconvenience, but potentially death if you couldn't reach help. Weather presented threats that modern infrastructure largely shields us from. Lightning could strike without the protection of lightning rods. Flash floods swept away unwary travelers, and sometimes entire communities built in vulnerable locations. Winter storms could trap people in their homes without adequate supplies. Summer heat waves, without air conditioning or proper hydration, caused fatalities through heat stroke. Each season brought its specific dangers, requiring constant vigilance and preparation. Disease lurked everywhere, invisible but deadly. Without understanding germ theory, medieval people unknowingly engaged in countless high-risk behaviors daily, sharing drinking vessels, handling waste without proper hand-washing, living in close proximity to diseased individuals. Every minor wound carried the risk of infection in a world without antiseptics or antibiotics. A simple cut could lead to blood poisoning and death within days. The human dangers were equally real. Violence was more common and less controlled in medieval society. Disputes that might now be resolved through legal processes could escalate to physical confrontation. Assault and theft posed real threats, especially in urban areas or on travel routes. Legal protection existed but was inconsistent and often depended on social status rather than universal application of law. For women, additional dangers existed. Childbirth was perhaps the most significant, with maternal mortality rates staggeringly high by modern standards. Sexual violence was a reality with limited legal recourse. Even pregnancy itself carried risks beyond the birth. Nutritional demands that might not be met in times of scarcity, physical vulnerability during late stages, and social consequences for pregnancies outside sanctioned relationships. Children faced a gauntlet of risks that modern parents would find unthinkable. Without concepts of childproofing or child safety, households were filled with hazards. Open fires, sharp tools, toxic substances used in daily crafts or food preparation. Supervision was limited by the constant demands of survival labor. Simple, exploratory behaviors that modern safety measures accommodate could be fatal in a medieval context. The physical environment contained countless dangers. Wells without protective barriers claimed lives through drowning. Structures built without modern engineering knowledge sometimes collapsed. Natural hazards, quicksand, sinkholes, unstable cliffs were unmarked. Wildlife posed varying threats depending on region. Wolves in some areas, venomous snakes or insects in others, and in some regions, larger predators like bears. Warfare, while not a daily reality for all medieval people, cast a shadow even in relatively peaceful regions. Beyond the obvious dangers of combat for those directly involved, war brought secondary threats to civilian populations. Food shortages as armies requisitioned supplies, increased risk of disease as people fled conflict zones, destruction of homes and infrastructure, and sometimes targeted violence against non-combatants. Even recreation carried risks. Medieval games and sports often involved physical contact without protective equipment. Celebrations and festivals, with their combination of alcohol, fire, and crowds, regularly resulted in injuries. Swimming, for those who lived near water bodies, was particularly dangerous. Few people knew how to swim. Understanding of water safety was limited, and natural water bodies contained hazards like strong currents and submerged objects. The psychological burden of living with these constant dangers shaped medieval consciousness. People developed coping mechanisms, religious practices for spiritual protection, community systems for mutual aid, practical knowledge passed through generations, and perhaps a different relationship with mortality itself. Death wasn't an unexpected tragedy, but a constant companion, acknowledged and prepared for rather than denied. Modern people benefit from countless safety systems so integrated into our lives that we barely notice them. Building codes, food safety regulations, traffic laws, warning labels, childproofing, electrical safety standards, and on and on. We expect dangers to be marked, mitigated, and managed. We assume that most daily activities, if performed with reasonable care, won't kill us. We trust that if injury or illness does occur, professional medical help is available. Medieval people had none of these assurances. Each day was navigated without safety nets, each activity performed with the knowledge that a mistake, a moment of bad luck, or simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time could be fatal. Survival required constant vigilance, practical knowledge, and often simply good fortune. Could you, modern person, maintain that level of constant awareness? Could you correctly identify and navigate dangers your upbringing never trained you to recognize? Could you accept and function with the understanding that death or serious injury might come at any moment from countless directions, without warning or recourse? This omnipresent risk, more than any specific hardship, might be what would ultimately make surviving in medieval Europe so challenging for a modern time traveler. It's not just that the dangers existed, it's that you would lack the instinctive awareness and habitual caution developed through a lifetime in that environment. Your modern risk assessment skills, finely tuned for our world of cars, electricity, and digital threats, would be mismatched to a completely different danger landscape. Perhaps the most sobering thought is this: for medieval people, the level of danger we've described wasn't extraordinary. It was simply life. They didn't perceive themselves as living in particularly hazardous conditions because they had no safer alternative to compare with. The constant presence of risk was the water they swam in, unremarkable because it was universal, and in that acceptance of danger as normal lies, perhaps the greatest difference between their worldview and ours. The strength of medieval people. As we've explored the many challenges of medieval life, the physical hardships, the social constraints, the religious worldview, the constant dangers, you might wonder how anyone survived at all. Yet survive they did, generation after generation, building civilizations, creating art, developing technologies, and laying the foundations for the modern world. Their resilience wasn't just a matter of luck or natural selection, it was the product of specific strengths and adaptations that modern people have largely lost. Physical endurance was perhaps the most obvious of these strengths. Medieval bodies were conditioned from childhood for sustained labor, while modern people might pride themselves on gym routines or weekend sports. Medieval work required a different kind of strength, not the ability to lift maximum weight briefly, but the capacity to perform moderate exertion continuously for 12 or more hours daily. This wasn't a lifestyle choice or fitness regimen, but simply what survival demanded. This endurance wasn't built through specialized training but through the work itself, beginning in early childhood. By age 5 or 6, children were performing meaningful labor. By adolescence, they were working essentially adult schedules. This lifelong conditioning created bodies adapted to specific types of exertion. A medieval farmer might lack a modern athlete's speed or explosive power, but could maintain a steady pace of physically demanding work from dawn to dusk, day after day, with minimal recovery time. Medieval people also developed remarkable specific skills through years of practice. Modern hands, accustomed to keyboards and touchscreens, would struggle with the precise control needed for traditional crafts. A medieval spinner could draw out perfectly consistent thread hour after hour by feel alone. A blacksmith could judge temperatures by the color of heated metal with accuracy comparable to modern instruments. A bowyer could select the perfect piece of wood by its look, feel, and even smell. These weren't rare talents, but common abilities developed through necessity and constant practice. Practical knowledge was accumulated and passed down through generations, creating a vast repository of survival wisdom. Medieval people knew which plants were edible, which had medicinal properties, and which were poisonous. Knowledge modern foraging enthusiasts spend years trying to reacquire. They could predict weather changes from subtle environmental cues. They understood the specific properties of materials, which woods burned hottest, which plants yielded the strongest fibers, which clays made the most durable pottery. This knowledge wasn't academic but practical, tested and refined through centuries of trial and error. Memory played a far greater role in medieval life than in our externalized information culture. Without widespread literacy or convenient reference materials, people memorized vast amounts of practical information, religious texts, oral histories, navigational landmarks, and traditional songs or stories. The modern habit of immediately looking up information rather than committing it to memory would have been not just impractical, but potentially fatal in a world where knowledge needed to be immediately accessible in critical situations. Sensory awareness was heightened by necessity. Medieval people were attuned to subtle changes in their environment that might signal danger or opportunity. They could distinguish the sounds of different animals at night, recognize the footsteps of specific horses or people, detect slight changes in wind direction that might indicate weather shifts, notice small variations in plant growth that suggested soil conditions or water sources. This wasn't supernatural perception, but simply the result of lives spent in direct connection with the natural world, without technological mediation. Communal interdependence was a core strength of medieval society. While modern people often pride themselves on independence, medieval survival depended on tight networks of mutual obligation and assistance. Labor was shared at critical times like harvest. Tools and resources too expensive for individual ownership were collectively managed. Knowledge was communal property, distributed through the group rather than concentrated in specialists or reference materials. This wasn't socialism or altruism as modern people might understand these concepts, but a practical recognition that individual survival required group cooperation. Adaptability within tradition characterized the medieval approach to challenges. While we often imagine medieval society as static and resistant to change, the reality was more nuanced. Innovation occurred constantly but incrementally, tested against existing knowledge rather than embraced for its own sake. New techniques or tools were adopted when they demonstrably improved outcomes within established systems. This balance, neither blindly traditional nor recklessly innovative, allowed for stability while gradually incorporating beneficial changes. Psychological resilience was perhaps the most significant medieval strength. Modern people often struggle with minor discomforts or inconveniences that medieval people would have considered too trivial to notice. The capacity to endure pain, hunger, cold, heat, fatigue, and uncertainty was developed through lifelong exposure to these conditions. This wasn't stoicism as philosophical choice but a practical emotional adaptation to a world where comfort was rare and suffering expected. This resilience extended to their relationship with mortality. Medieval people lived with constant reminders of death. High infant mortality, regular epidemics, public executions, shorter lifespans. Rather than producing paralysis or despair, This familiarity with death was integrated into their worldview. Death wasn't denied or hidden away, but acknowledged as an ordinary part of existence. This acceptance didn't eliminate grief, but provided cultural frameworks for processing it and continuing to function, even amid loss. Medieval spirituality, which we've explored as a worldview, was also a source of strength. Religious belief offered explanations for suffering, guidelines for behavior in difficult situations, communities of support, and hope for ultimate justice beyond earthly hardships. Whether or not their metaphysical beliefs were objectively true, the psychological benefits were real. Faith provided purpose and meaning in circumstances that might otherwise have seemed arbitrary and cruel. Practical creativity flourished within material constraints. Modern innovation often relies on new materials or technologies. Medieval creativity worked within strict limitations of available resources. When a tool broke, it was repaired with whatever was at hand. When a crop failed, alternative food sources were developed from previously overlooked plants. This ingenuity wasn't expressed in patents or publications, but in the daily improvisations that meant the difference between survival and disaster. Traditional knowledge included significant medical and healing practices that, while lacking modern theoretical frameworks, often proved effective. Herbal remedies contained active compounds later validated by pharmaceutical science. Setting of broken bones, wound cleaning, and certain surgical techniques were developed to impressive levels despite limited understanding of underlying biological processes. This wasn't equivalent to modern medicine but represented sophisticated practical knowledge adapted to available resources. Community justice systems, while harsher and less procedurally consistent than modern legal systems, maintained social order through intimate knowledge of local individuals and circumstances. Village elders or councils could consider factors invisible to formal courts, historical patterns, family dynamics, individual capacities and limitations. At its best, this personalized justice could be more rehabilitative and proportionate than our more abstract systems, though it was also vulnerable to bias and abuse. Perhaps most importantly, medieval people possessed perspective that modern affluence has obscured. They understood the true value of necessities: clean water, sufficient food, secure shelter, community bonds, in ways that consumer societies, surrounded by manufactured needs and artificial scarcity, have largely forgotten. Their appreciation for small pleasures and achievements came from genuine contrast with hardship, not from manufactured gratitude practices or mindfulness exercises. None of this romanticizes the genuine suffering and limitations of medieval life. Child mortality, physical pain, hunger, and oppression were real and devastating. But recognizing the strengths and capabilities of medieval people helps us understand how they not merely survived, but created lasting cultural achievements, technological innovations, and social structures under conditions modern people would find unbearable. The medieval peasant working a field with primitive tools wasn't a mindless drone, but a skilled practitioner of complex agricultural techniques. The castle builder, without modern engineering education, wasn't guessing at structural principles, but applying sophisticated knowledge gained through practical experience and guild training. The midwife without formal medical credentials wasn't merely hoping for good outcomes, but carefully applying tested techniques passed through generations. If modern people seem softer, less resilient, more dependent on external systems, it's not because we're inherently weaker, it's because the environments that shaped us didn't require or reward the same capabilities. Our strengths lie elsewhere, in abstract thinking, information processing, technological interface navigation, and social adaptability to rapidly changing circumstances. These are the capacities our world demands and develops. So, could you, modern person, survive a day in medieval Europe? Physically, perhaps, though the strain would be enormous. Practically, you would lack countless essential skills and knowledge. Socially, you would struggle to navigate unfamiliar hierarchies and expectations. Spiritually, you would find yourself in an alien conceptual landscape. The dangers would be greater because you wouldn't recognize them instinctively. The hardships would be harder because you haven't developed lifelong tolerance for them. But the greatest challenge might be this: the modern belief that individual comfort, safety, fulfillment, and autonomy are natural rights, rather than rare historical anomalies. Medieval people didn't expect life to be easy, fair, or even particularly long. They didn't assume they deserved comfort, or that suffering indicated something had gone wrong. Their baseline expectations, formed by necessity and reinforced by religious teaching, allowed them to find satisfaction and meaning in conditions modern people would consider intolerable. This isn't to suggest that medieval people were happier, or that their lives were better. By most objective measures of physical well-being, modern life clearly offers enormous advantages, but understanding their resilience, skills, and perspective gives us a fuller picture of what it meant to be human in a pre-industrial, pre-scientific, pre-individualistic world. It reminds us that survival, and even flourishing, are possible under conditions far removed from modern comforts and assumptions. Perhaps the most valuable insight from this journey through medieval daily life is the recognition of how thoroughly our expectations, capacities, and limitations are shaped by our historical moment and material circumstances. The differences between us and our medieval ancestors aren't primarily genetic, but cultural and environmental, the product of radically different worlds that demanded and developed different human capacities. Would you survive that single day in medieval Europe? The honest answer is not as yourself. You would need to become someone else entirely, shaped by different experiences, driven by different necessities, thinking in different categories, skilled in different ways. The medieval world didn't just contain different objects and activities, it produced fundamentally different human beings. As you drift off to sleep tonight, in your comfortable bed with climate control, clean water at the tap, and emergency services a phone call away, perhaps take a moment to appreciate not just these material comforts, but the remarkable human adaptability that allowed your ancestors to survive and even thrive in conditions so different from your own. Their strength lives on in you, dormant perhaps, but part of the human heritage that makes our species so extraordinarily resilient across time and circumstance. Sleep well, knowing that while you probably wouldn't last a day in medieval Europe, the medieval people who did, your ancestors, passed down the capacity for adaptation that allows each generation to flourish in its own time, however strange that time might seem to those who came before.